And that concludes the testimony of the Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell and Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin before the House Financial Services Committee chaired by Maxine Waters, who was just speaking there to conclude it just now. They spoke for perhaps a bit more than 90 minutes. They got started a bit late. Originally scheduled for 10:30 in the morning, was closer to 11 o'clock. Wide range of questions asked, subjects covered, but a couple of the principal ones were Chairman Powell saying, though the economy has made progress, we still have a long ways to go, mentioning 11 million people still unemployed. And he did say that he thought that it was likely that further fiscal and monetary stimulus would be needed for the economy. On the other hand, Secretary of Treasury Stephen Mnuchin said if there's going to be more stimulus, it should be targeted. And he kept talking about jobs and kids, with some talk about small business as well. Also, a lot of talk about commercial real estate and about that Main Street lending program. But for more perspective on this now, we bring in Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent. So, Mike, thanks so much for being with us. What struck you about the testimony?
Well, that neither man, Secretary Mnuchin or Chairman Powell, had any specific answers to what kind of fiscal help could be brought. As you mentioned, the Treasury Secretary, a little bit more able to talk politics, looked at the idea of targeted help, but they're both leaving it up to members of Congress to come up with exactly what should be done. A lot of people asked both of them about whether they should come up with some sort of smaller Main Street lending program, maybe perhaps with loans as low as $100,000. And they both said that really wouldn't work under the system they have now. They'd have to design a completely new program, or Congress could pass another round of the PPP funding. And Secretary Mnuchin said there's still $134 million in that fund that they could use if they reauthorized it. Beyond that, I think one of the bigger aspects of it was the commercial real estate section, where a lot of members asked what could be done to help out commercial real estate landlords, because so many companies are going out of business, so many of their tenants. And at this point, both of them said they didn't know. They didn't have the authority under the law to do something. And so they're, again, leaving it up to Congress.
Yeah, it really struck me, particularly Secretary Mnuchin at one point said, this is a real problem. We don't have an answer, and Congress has to fix it. But I didn't hear much of a suggestion from him or from the chairman about what that solution might look like.
Yeah, they don't seem to have a plan at this point. I think that Secretary Mnuchin would be willing to work through something with members on Capitol Hill if they could figure out exactly what to do. Secretary Powell, of course, would work behind the scenes, but he steps out of any specifics when he's speaking in public.
It strikes me, Mike, that actually the chairman had a particularly challenging time today, because almost at the same time he had one of the regional Fed presidents, Charlie Evans of Chicago, out saying, well, you know what, I think maybe we're going to have to raise rates at some point. Did people misunderstand? Because it looked like the markets, the long end of the market, the 30 years, actually moved on the news.
Yeah, I think it was kind of an unusual situation, Charlie Evans giving a speech today. And it appears he was asked whether or not zero rates apply to the idea of a 2% average inflation. In other words, do you leave rates at zero until you get there? And he said, no, maybe not. We might have to raise rates a little bit before we get to 2.5%. And that has caused a market reaction. The Fed has not specified what it means by when it would raise rates, how long it would let inflation go over 2%, even how far it would let inflation go over 2%. And so the market's kind of filling in the holes, and that's an issue for Jay Powell. Unfortunately, this was not really the venue for him to respond.
Yeah, also struck me, there was some talk about the coronavirus. At one point, Chair Powell said, we want to get the country reopened, the economy reopened, but we have to do it in a sustainable way. And he particularly went out of his way to talk about masks.
Yes, the Fed chairman has always made it clear that controlling the virus is the way to get the economy back on track. He said it over and over and over again. And I think he wanted to make that clear to members of Congress, some of whom maybe for political reasons don't want to support that. Secretary Mnuchin didn't take a position on that particular comment, but was wearing a mask. So both of them sort of reinforcing that idea.
What about the Main Street lending program? It took a long time to get it up and running. I don't know how much has really been dispersed under it. And there were a lot of questions about it, almost criticism. Why aren't you doing more under it? As you said at one point, said, can't we go under 100,000? And we had the Fed chair saying, there's just no appetite for that.
Yeah, it's been a problem. Part of it was that it took a long time to stand up, and part of it is that it is a bit onerous, and banks are worried about losing money, so they don't necessarily want to make loans. only about $1.5 billion has been lent, and this is a program that could go up to $600 billion. So there are real questions about what's gone wrong here. And what seems to be the case is that if you're a credit-worthy company, it took so long to stand this up, you went out and got a bank loan, and you're okay. And if you have problems, then banks are kind of reluctant to make loans to you because they don't want to take losses, and they're also worried about what their regulators will say. Friday, the Fed put out new guidance to banks saying, you can take a chance on these people. Whether or not that helps, we don't know. We'll have to wait and see. The 100,000 is also an idea that relates to the size of the companies. The Fed originally said it was $1 million company that had to be for the medium-sized companies they were going to lend to. And now members of Congress are talking about much smaller companies because so many are facing financial difficulties. And neither man said that's a bad idea, but basically they said we don't have the facility to do that now. Maybe go back and look at the PPP again.
Yeah, when they're looking at creditworthiness, I must say I've heard EBITDA talked about in Congress more than I ever thought I would in my lifetime. They're all very, very, very sophisticated about their EBITDA figures now. Thanks very much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee for joining us. And we turn now to Mark Crumpton because he's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump addressed the United Nations General Assembly today. In remarks taped at the White House, the president blamed China for the global spread of the coronavirus.
We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. In the earliest days of the virus, China locked down travel domestically while allowing flights to leave China and infect the world.
President Trump also called for the international body to punish Beijing. He also criticized China's environmental record. The European Union summit has been postponed for a week because EU Council President Charles Michel has gone into quarantine after close contact with a security officer who tested positive for COVID-19. The summit scheduled for Thursday and Friday was set to address issues as wide-ranging as Brexit negotiations, climate change, and the tensions between Greece and Turkey over energy rights. Britain is taking major steps to stem the spread of the coronavirus. Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced new restrictions today, saying the nation has reached, quote, a perilous turning point. He asked people to work from home if possible. He also ordered pubs and restaurants to close early. The new measures are likely to last for 6 months. Face coverings will become mandatory for passengers in taxis and workers in the hospitality and retail sectors, with tougher fines for people who don't comply. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up here, we're going to talk about the partisan battle over the replacement for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what that could mean for any stimulus bill or even for keeping the government going. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in state at the Supreme Court tomorrow, even as a partisan battle rages just across the street at the Capitol, with the Republican Senate caucus meeting today on whether and how to move forward to vote on whomever President Trump nominates this coming Saturday. We welcome now our political contributor, Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College. So, Jeannie, give us your take at this point. We heard from Senator Mitt Romney today saying he would go forward with a vote. They're having a caucus lunch, as I understand it, today of the Republicans. Is it a foregone conclusion?
I do think that with Romney on board officially now and publicly, very hard to stop the momentum of the Republicans in the Senate, that they will move forward. We don't know yet what the date of an actual vote may be. Of course, the time frame is pretty narrow. If the president makes a nomination on Saturday, you're talking, it would be amongst the quickest nomination votes in history. But it is possible. Whether they do it before or after the election, I think they will do it by the end of the year without question.
Well, but if they do it after the election, doesn't it become even more difficult, if anything can be more difficult in this world? Because what if, and we don't know what will happen in the election, but what if, in fact, the Senate switches over to Democrat, who becomes effective January 2nd, as I understand it, so you'd have people voting on this who have lost their jobs. They just aren't out yet.
Absolutely. You know, if you imagine the Republicans lose the Senate and potentially the White House, you would have people, as you mentioned, voting who will no longer have their jobs come early January. Constitutionally, of course, there's nothing to stop a lame duck Senate from voting, but politically, it does make it that much more difficult for Republicans. I think the push will be to get this done before the election, if that's, of course, possible, because this is a process that takes some time. Even if you're talking about a nomination of somebody who's been recently vetted, it's still, you know, it's not as time-consuming. They've met with many of the senators recently, but it still does take some time. Democrats can slow it up maybe by a week or so, but I think Republicans will want to get this done fairly quickly.
So this might be in the weeds, but although it may actually become important, talks about the Senate race out in Arizona and Mark Kelly, the former astronaut, who's running against Senator McSally. If he were to win, he actually could take his seat in the Senate before the new year.
Absolutely. So, and he is up in the polls. It looks like he could be the winner out there against McSally. And since this is a special election to finish, this was finishing McCain's term. Since this is a special election, he could, if he wins again, could be sworn in as soon as the results are officially certified. So if that was the case, you would have, you know, imagine, you know, Kelly would now be somebody on the Democratic side taking a vote away from Republicans on this thing. That could throw a monkey wrench into a vote if the vote doesn't occur until after the election. And again, there's a lot of ifs there. If he wins, of course, we don't know. And if the vote is certified quickly, with these elections in the midst of a pandemic, we don't know how quickly we will get a certification, but he will be the first Democrat, if he wins, to certainly take a seat in the Senate this year.
Jeannie, meanwhile, back at Congress, there are some other things they have to do besides worrying about the successor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, we have the stimulus bill we've heard about so much that has not gone anywhere, and we even have a continuing resolution to just keep the government going after the 1st of October.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a few small things on the table for the Senate. As many of these senators and all members of the House and a third of the Senate are trying to run for election or re-election. So all of these things happening. We did hear Nancy Pelosi over the weekend talk about the fact that there is still widespread support to keep the government open. So the CR, you know, we imagine the CR will go forward and that they will agree on that. But, of course, really nothing is off the table at this point. Democrats want to slow this thing down, and so you can imagine there will be pressure on Democrats to do what they can. So I'm not sure, you know, how this thing will pan out in terms of the continuing resolution. And, of course, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We still don't have a deal on that. So, you know, a lot on the table as these people try to go off and run for re-election and, of course, deal with a nomination.
Okay, thank you so much. Always wonderful to have you with us. That's Jeannie Zaino. She's Bloomberg political contributor. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Max Baucus, former ambassador to China and a member of the Senate for some 36 years. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Ambassador Max Baucus was U.S. emissary to Beijing under President Obama, but before that, he served for nearly 36 years representing his home state of Montana in the United States Senate, including as chairman of the Finance Committee. We welcome now back to Bloomberg. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. Let's start with the Senate hat, if we could start with that, because there's so much going on, even as we speak, with respect to the possible confirmation of a successor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There was a day that we talked about the Senate as being the deliberative body. It had various rules to ensure sort of comity among the members. Are those gone?
Well, it is a different Senate today. Earlier, the process was much more orderly. Frankly, I voted on 12 different Supreme Court nominees. The first was Sandra Day O'Connor, and she was treated very respectfully. And that continued for some time. But then after a while, the confirmation process became more political. It really began with Bork, and then later, obviously, with later nominees, Kavanaugh, for example, and now with whoever Trump's going to appoint to the court. It's very disturbing because the rules are changing constantly. It's hard to know what the rules are. They're basically set by the majority party at the whenever the majority wants to set the rules. And that another disturbing point to me is the court itself is becoming more political. The classic situation in the Constitution is we have a Congress that writes legislation, of course, quite political. We have a president who executes the law, of course, is quite political in a certain sense. But the court was supposed to be the independent arbiter. But now that's starting to change. The composition of the court is becoming political as well. And I think it's starting to very subtly undermine a basic American tenet, and that's the rule of law. The rule of law is being shaken a bit. It's more a rule by fiat and instant political maneuvering.
Yeah, and it feels almost sometimes like we've got a rivalry going on between Republicans and Democrats, because the Democrats now say, well, you have to remember that when Harry Reid was majority leader, he did away with the 60 rule to get some Court of Appeals judges in. Is the next step actually the possibility, if the Democrats take power in the Senate and also the White House, that we actually could expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court? That's something being talked about.
It is being talked about, and I find it disturbing, because it really is evidence that the Congress wants to be continually political in the appointment of Supreme Court nominees. Now, of course, if President Trump is successful in getting a conservative member confirmed by the Senate this year, that theoretically changes the court composition, 6 conservatives to 3 more progressives or liberals. Then the argument is, well, gee, if Biden becomes president, and certainly if the Senate flips to the Democratic column, gee, why shouldn't Democrats add 2 more justices to the court? I find that disturbing, because it makes the court even continually political, because presumably those nominees will be progressives. And so what are we doing here? Each time we get a new president, a new Senate, we're just going to put our men and women on who fit our political points of view. Right. That's not what the court should be.
Well, exactly. I couldn't agree more. That does at least bring into question the rule of law in this country, which is so important. Let's move to your other hat now as former ambassador to China. We had President Trump today addressing the United Nations General Assembly virtually. They're all addressing it virtually. And he had some fairly harsh things to say about China. Listen to part of what he had to say. This is what he said.
We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. In the earliest days of the virus, China locked down travel domestically while allowing flights to leave China and infect the world.
So there you have it, Mr. Ambassador. That's not very diplomatic talk. They seem to just be getting worse and worse and worse. Is this just campaign rhetoric that we should expect, frankly, maybe from both sides, from former Vice President Biden as well as from President Trump?
I think it's about 2/3 campaign rhetoric, but I also think it's about 1/3 real. The feeling in the United States today, with some justification, is that China's not been behaving appropriately, whether it's in handling the virus or trade or even in geopolitical matters. And America is starting to be anxious about China and starting to react against China. Recent Pew polls show that the number of Americans who have an unfavorable view toward China is up around 60-70%. That just skyrocketed the last 3 or 4 years. So it's partly politics, it's political positioning, it's partly real, but it begs the deeper questions. Okay, how do we deal with China appropriately in the best way? And I think that we have to recognize that China's not going anywhere. China's not going to leave this earth. They're big. They're huge. They got a big economy, and they're going to be a major player. And we just have to figure out a way to work with China, but in a way where China respects us. If China begins to respect us more, in addition to trust us, but respect us more, I think then we're going to start to have a more stable policy. And we have to have a policy which is not based on tweets. Right. The more we publicly criticize China, the more it makes it difficult. So exactly. You've got to be more diplomatic.
It's very wise words. Thank you so much to Max Baucus. He's former U.S. ambassador to China. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to the founder of the Voter Participation Center. That's coming up on Bloomberg.